This is Damon Fordham, author and historian, as well as adjunct professor of history at the Citadel and Charleston Southern University here in Charleston, South Carolina. And I'm here to talk to you this evening about the fact that during the days of the struggle for human rights, there were many people who never made the history books. And one of them was the Reverend Joel L. King of Mount Moriah Baptist Church in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Now, Reverend King was born in Georgia, and around 1946 he came to Spartanburg, South Carolina, which is also the town of my birth, where he became the minister of Mount Moriah Baptist Church, which at that time was on the corner of South Liberty and Young Streets, which is incidentally today the church is over on South Church Street. Interesting coincidence. Anyway, Reverend Joel L. King, who is shown here, as you see, he was a rather handsome-looking young man at the time. One of the people who were on his, served him in the church. As a matter of fact, you see a list of names here and what they served. One of them was a lady mentioned here by the name of Minnie Montgomery, who was head of the Mothers Board of the church. Minnie Montgomery, who was in her 70s at the time, is this lady shown right here with this dress, as you see right here. Minnie Montgomery was, in fact, my maternal great-grandmother. But anyway, Reverend King was serving at a very interesting time in South Carolina's history. Things were kind of heating up throughout the South. On July 12, 1947, in Charleston, South Carolina, Judge Julius Waties Waring, a white judge, ruled that South Carolina could no longer forbid black people from voting in the Democratic primary. And that was revolutionary for the time because it meant that black people could vote in large numbers in South Carolina for the first time since the Reconstruction days. And a lot of people risked their necks at that time to get a lot of black people to register to vote. And also, as 1948 was turning into 1947, Harry S. Truman, the president, was beginning to push for civil rights legislation that would eventually wind up integrating the United States Army and making anti-discrimination laws among the federal government. And needless to say, that met great resistance from many people in the South. Why? Simple fact was that the people who ran the South in those days wanted a permanent class of cheap labor. And what better way for them to do that was to keep the poor whites and the poor blacks divided, so that way the poor blacks would get almost nothing. The poor whites would get a little bit more than them, but for the most part, they were also poorly paid. So therefore, as long as the poor whites' anger was focused on the blacks, they wouldn't be able to see that the people up top were running things. So with the blacks as a sort of psychological salve to their low self-esteem that they could look down on, they were actually supporting a system that kept them both down. So now that I've done that explanation, here's the rest of the story. So due to all this resistance, it took courage to speak out against those things. On February the 22nd, 1948, in the pulpit of Mount Moriah Baptist Church in South Carolina, he said these words. He took his text from Isaiah 28, chapter 28, the 20th verse that said, "The bed is too short and the covering narrow than a man can wrap himself into it." He went on to say, the whole South would lose if the Southern Democratic Party broke away from the National Party over this racial issue. We don't want to be a part of the white man's social life, but we do want to vote and have equal educational rights. This bill would cure the ills of the South for both whites and Negroes. Here in the South, Negroes are excluded from the polls by the Democratic Club. And to tie in with the biblical verse, he said this, "The blanket is too small for South Carolina and the Negroes are left conspicuously from its covering." May not seem like much today, but back then, that took nerve. And the headline in the Charleston News and Courier of the next day said, "Negro minister hits governor's stand. A Negro Baptist minister last night used a biblical theme in opposing Southern governors appearing today in opposition for President Truman's civil rights program. And you know, it turned out that he was right, because the South broke from the Democratic Party that year. And James Strom Thurmond, yes, that Strom Thurmond, ran for president on the Dixiecrat ticket and lost badly. And eventually, of course, a stronger civil rights bill was passed some 16 years after this. But Reverend Joel L. King's example was very courageous for that time. And a lot of people were very nervous in Spartanburg about him, because that was just so revolutionary. But here's something else interesting that happened. In 2003, a member of the church at that time named John Goodwin was interviewed. And he and several of the others mentioned that Reverend Joel L. King would also bring a nephew of his who was becoming a strong preacher in his own right to preach at that church when he was a young man. You see, Reverend Joel L. King's nephew was named Martin Luther Jr. And as a very well-known storyteller used to say, Paul Harvey, when I was a boy, he used to say, "And now you know the rest of the story." This is Damon Fordham on the courage of the Reverend Joel L. King.